introduce our speaker and our session for today. Thank you.
Hi, I just want to welcome you all. We now have back our speaker that we had previously, Vasudha Narayanan, who is at the University of Florida, is a distinguished professor of religion. And today she's going to talk about Hindu architecture, the traditional architecture in India, Southeast Asia, and if time permits, even a little bit in the United States.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you all for being here this morning. I really appreciate it. And I just love talking in front of the Taj Mahal. I've never done that before. My goodness, what a treat.
You deserve it.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, all this love. Thank you. I'll be talking about the architecture.
That's beautiful.
Thank you. That's Angkor Wat at dawn, at sunrise. I took this picture in 2006. During the monsoon time, the clouds kind of make the light come out more vividly. Well, if you can indulge me, I'm going to do something which I wouldn't have done the first week or two that I was here. But now that I've been here like 5 weeks, this is my 5th week here, but I know time flies when we're all having fun here. I'm going to, please indulge me. I want to share my pictures of my newest neighbors with you. I know, right across my house. There's an empty lot, and I went out to water the garden yesterday, and there's a big crowd of people outside my home. And I thought, geez, I know I'm famous and all, and they're probably here to get my autograph. But then I saw they had their backs turned towards me. So I went there, and there are 3 beautiful little foxes, and they were playing around, and they were just gorgeous. So sorry about that. That's got nothing to do with the architecture of India, but it brought me as much pleasure, I should say. Thank you. So we're talking about the architecture of Hindu India. I wondered originally if I should do a little bit of Islam and Buddhism too, but that was a huge topic in itself. And I eventually ended up discarding about 150 slides from other religious traditions. And that's a whole talk in itself. And maybe I'll just invite myself over another time and come and give this free and compulsory talk.
We have that recorded.
Okay. So today we'll look at a few temples in Cambodia, India, and the United States. Not necessarily that order. We'll start with India briefly, about 2 or 3 minutes in Cambodia, and about 5-10 minutes in United States. And the purpose of the talk is really to give you a sense of the size, the architecture, the functions, what goes on there, what's the kind of stuff that happens, and when, and a chronological idea of the history. So it's really to give you a visual dimension to the activities there. Starting off, I think I should say that Hindus have really considered a sacred landscape to be vital to their prayers. So the rivers and the mountains of India have been very sacred, and they alone, without any temples, have been shrines for many of the people. So even now, you will see many shrines, many temples have come up exactly near the rivers, at the foothills of the mountains, and so on. Many of the rivers are female, and all of them have names which we actually give to men and women in India. So the men and women are named after Rocky Mountains. Well, close enough. But boys are called Kailash and so on, and girls are called Ganga, Yamuna, Jamuna, after the rivers. So the early manifestations really go back several millennia. And some of these are in the World Heritage Sites. And They are not Hindu because the word Hindu, if you remember what we spoke about in the very first week, is really a name which was geographic and referred to people who lived on the east of the river Sindhu, which the Greeks call Indus. The Indus River flows through the country that we call Pakistan today. It was called Sindhu by the local people, and the Persians who couldn't say S dropped the S and called the people who lived near the Sindhu Indu. And till the medieval times, it was probably a geographic term. By the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, it began to apply to people who are not Muslim. And then eventually, today, it actually refers, the word legally is defined as anyone who's not Christian, Muslim, or Zoroastrian by faith. And that brings Buddhists and Sikhs and Jains by default under the Hindu legal umbrella, though there have been exceptions to that in the recent years. So we'll start briefly with cave architecture and many of the early and paintings. Many of the earliest temples have been scooped out caves, and they would leave spaces for the pillars and the columns out there. I'll start in the middle of India, Bhimbetka caves, and the Bhimbetka, near that is a Heliodorus column. Does the name sound Greek? Yes, it is. And Helio, of course, from the sun. And he, although he calls himself Heliodorus, he's actually a Hindu. Turns out he adopts Hindu customs. And the Udayagiri caves, so the early caves become the site of the earliest architecture. The Bhimbetka caves in Madhya Pradesh, some actually put the paintings there at the earliest strata back to 6000 BCE. Most of these are really in the first millennium BCE, but we have the prehistoric paintings, hunters, people dancing, and so on. And right close to this are the early Hindu and Buddhist temples. And a point that many art historians make, and actually people who study religion, is that it's kind of a palimpsest. Many of these early places which bear a sense of religiosity, we don't know what religion they were in 4000 or 5000 BCE, or what did they follow. But those areas remain holy and sacred. And eventually the Buddhists come and the Hindus come, or the people whom we call Hindus today, but they make that site holy and they erect their own temples there. And keep that point in mind, because I'll come back to it at the end of the hour today. There is a method in my madness. So I'll come back to it when we come back to the United States. So what is a temple in India? A Hindu temple, it's a palace for the deities. There are multiple deities. In case you don't remember a conversation that I was talking about 5 weeks ago, how many gods are there? And the answer was, I said, 330 million, give or take. Now, the phrase 330 million in Sanskrit is more like jargon, like saying a Brazilian. It's just a figure of speech. So the conversation goes, and this is a conversation from a text composed in 600 BCE, 600 before the Common Era. And the conversation is, how many gods are there? And the answer, 330 million. Are you sure? No. 330. Are you sure? 33. Really? 3. Are you sure? 1.5. 1.5? 1, but it's 330 million. The idea is to push your mind towards infinity, to say there are God or the supreme being. Let's not use the word God here. The Indians use the word supreme being, Brahman, which is ineffable, which cannot be described, which cannot be conceptualized by words or thought. It's beyond number, beyond gender. And so the first picture here on your left shows God half woman, half male, literally, physically. The left part is female. So you have to think of God as male and female. The middle is zoomorphic, God with an elephant head. And the third on the right-hand side is, thank you so much. May I actually, sorry, can I bother you for some coffee with cream and sugar? Thank you. I haven't had my caffeine yet this morning. I was so hung up with the foxes and that I couldn't have my coffee. And on the right-hand side, you see a goddess of knowledge and wisdom. So the deity can be envisaged in any which way you can. And for convenience, we say God is one. But it really means it's more than one. And in fact, many of the philosophies in India are called non-dual, not two, non-dual. Why? Because a number is a limitation. And so you're saying it's not two, it's not male, it's not this, not that, neti, neti. It's not any of this. And you go to it. Nevertheless, having said it, people are people, they conceptualize God in their favorite ways, and that is real. And my God is always better than your God. And so there have been fights about that through history. Visually speaking, and this is the first minute is simply an overview, and then I'll get back into the history. The overview, many early cave temples and later temples were built frequently near bodies of water, like I told you a few minutes back. And this is one of the earlier cave temples that was built, 600 CE, 600 CE. So that's about 1,400 years ago. And many of these were elaborately carved. And these cave temples and the later temples came up near lakes and rivers. And sometimes the towers can be large complexes. They span 55, 60 acres at other times. They're tiny little roadside shrines. One of the larger temples is Sri Rangam. It's on 50 acres with dozens of shrines of different gods. Think of it as a temple complex like this, like a buffet table. You go there, you don't have to go to all the shrines. You worship your favorite gods and you come right back. So it's more like a smorgasbord, so to speak, here. Thank you so much. I have my caffeine here and I'm all set. And none of these temples are ever finished. When we come to America, I'll show you. The minute you finish a particular tower or hall, you're ready for the next. An ideal temple, according to the early texts, had 7 pathways around the central shrine. The number 7 comes up in many religions, 7 heavens, 7 hells also. And so it possibly goes back, we are not sure which tradition. It may go back to the time of Gilgamesh and Mesopotamia. We are not really sure. And people get very nationalistic about it. And temples like this have architecture all the way from the 5th, 6th century CE till today, which is very recent, 16th, 17th century, is literally yesterday in India. So let's begin with just before the Common Era. Many earlier monuments may have been made with perishable material, so we don't have too many of them. But in the early 5th and 6th century CE, we have cave temples and then rock-cut temples. So this is the Heliodorus pillar I was going to tell you about. And why is it so right smack in the middle of India? Interestingly enough, someone showed how around 600 CE, the Tropic of Cancer went right through this line. And through the precession of equinoxes, it took me a while to learn that phrase, okay? So it's now moved a little south of that, but it takes a while to get there. So this is the column. It was built in 150 BCE, and it was erected in honor of the Hindu god Vishnu. I showed a picture of him many moons ago, and I'll show more a little later today. The word Vishnu, and Vishnu is one of the Hindu gods, really important Hindu god. The word Vishnu means all pervasive. He who is in every nanoparticle of the universe, or he, she, because he comes as androgynous too. And usually he's seen as reclining on a serpent bed, the serpent symbolizing infinity and time. So just in that one icon, you have a deity who's a master of space and time. It's kind of like a hologram almost. So this Heliodorus pillar, the Greek devotee of Vishnu, and there were many Greeks here. Alexander the Great came knocking on the doors of India 323, about that BCE. So this is 200 years before this pillar is built. Since then, the Greco-Roman Empire existed in what we would call today Afghanistan, parts of Pakistan, and so on. So literally that was all part of Greater India in those days. So a great deal of Greek influence and Roman influence, especially by way of art, existed then. And so some of the early depictions of the Buddha shows him as wearing a tunic, a toga-like, very Romanesque tunic. So this pillar, which you saw a minute back, there's a little sign there, and the local Muslims think of it as a sacred pillar. And the Muslims call it the Kamb Baba. And it's worshipped by fishermen. And it bears two inscriptions from 1500. And it says it's in the honor of Vishnu by Heliodorus, and he calls himself a Greek inhabitant of Taxila, and so on. And he has actually done it. Very close to it are the Udayagiri caves. We are fast forwarding 500 years after the Heliodorus Column, 400 BCE. And in the early caves here, which are 401 CE, we have depictions of the early Hindu gods. And yes, many of them are in a very loving, amorous kind of depictions here that you find. And you'll find that continuing. The body was celebrated and continued to be celebrated for a long time. There's always been an ascetic trend within Hinduism which decried that and said, that's bad stuff. That never cramped the style of the Hindus. They went on celebrating the human body. You go to a temple, it's hardly a place where renunciation takes place. It's an assault on your senses. The smell, the fragrance of incense, the visual opulence of the temple, the music, I mean, it's overpowering. And music, visual stuff, as well as the fragrances were all part of the religious experience. And here we find stories from the ancient Indian narratives, like one called The Churning of the Ocean of Milk, a zoomorphic, anthropomorphic deity, Vishnu, who is got a head of a boar, and the boar saves the earth. And this image is used today to ask us to take care of the earth, to be stewards of the earth. Just as Vishnu saves the earth, we too should take care of this earth. So the environmental message is built into the old Hindu gods. One of my favorite places in the middle of India, a little south of Udayagiri, a couple of 100 miles south, is called Badami Caves. Notice the caves which are naturally orange and blue. There is something cosmic in those colors, really. But it is orange and blue. And look at the caves. This was literally scooped out of the mountains, and the pillars, the columns remained. So they were not put in and stuck there. The rocks were there, and they scooped out around it, and they carved around it also. And it overlooks an artificial lake. When they don't have a lake, you make one. And the columns all chiseled by hands, are incredibly done. And there's images of Vishnu there, and I don't have time to show all of them or any of them, are like 8 feet tall, really tall ones. Here on the banks of the little artificial lake is a tiny little shrine. And inside that, you see an image of Vishnu, the one I was talking about a few minutes earlier, reclining on the snake, the serpent bed. The serpent is called Ananta. Anta means end. Ananta means without end, infinity. And Vishnu, as I said, is all pervasive. So he who is all pervasive, reclining on the coils of time, that's the name of the deity. But so when you see this, you immediately get a feeling of omnipotence. And at the back of him are carved the 10 avatars. Avatar is now a word that we use in games, video games. And there's a movie called Avatar also a short while back. Avatar is a Sanskrit word which means descent of the deity to earth. Literally, incarnation. So there are many incarnations of Vishnu, and I told you the first story of Vishnu's incarnations in my first talk, how he comes as a fish and saves Manu from the primeval man from a flood. So it's one of the archetypal flood stories. Everyone is bad, and Vishnu comes as a fish, harnesses the big boat that he asks Manu to build, and in the boat are the seeds of all the animals, and he saves them. That's the first incarnation or avatar of Vishnu. And then it goes on, and the 9th incarnation is a name that you may have heard here as in Hare Krishna. The name Krishna. Krishna is the 9th incarnation of Vishnu, and the 10th incarnation is going to come in the future at the end of this cycle of time. So it's a messianic figure, a millennial figure almost, but don't hold your breath. It's not going to be anytime soon. This cycle of time is the shortest one ever, the shortest. And that's 432,000 years, and we're just 6,000 years into it. So if you think things are bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. So. And these are simply the sites from that place. Patadakal, World Heritage Site, was a metropolis. These are ruins today. But these temples, Aihole and Patadakal, which are part of the world, the heritage list, were enormous, the metropolis of the world. This is where, why am I showing this? Historically, it's a moment when temple architecture in the 7th and 8th century is at a crossroads. It's not just that the city itself was at a crossroads. This is a complex which was built by 2 queens. Okay, let's get that out of the way. It was built by 2 queens, but it's like a subdivision that you'd find in this country. Except instead of houses, you have different kinds of temples. And each temple has a different style of architecture. So it's a cradle of temple architecture right there within that 1 century. And from there, historically, we have 2 different styles, 3 emerging, North Indian, South Indian, and so on. So there are different styles of architecture, and this is the moment where the split begins to take place in the styles itself. The royal emblems were all carved into the temples. So a temple is a spiritual place, it's a place of piety, but it's also a place of power. The kings built it to show, I am powerful, and the queens built it for the same reason, to say this is a prestige temple. Hang on to that thought, because I'll come back to that when we come to the United States. So these are the kinds of temples in Patadakal. Notice that the shrine, the tower, is what we call curvy linear. That is, it's not a straight line. It's curved slightly. And this is the style that becomes dominant in northern India later on. whereas South India has straight lines, angular, very geometric. Here, the North Indian style becomes very curved. So again, on the banks of a river, walls intricately carved. The swastika was a very ancient and very sacred sign for the Hindus, since it brings about very, very tragic connections. I've passed over that image quickly so I can explain what the meaning of swastika is. The word swastika is Sanskrit, from the old Indian Sanskrit language. Swastika comes from two words, su, which means good, asti, well-being, existence. Swasti, therefore, means good health, well-being, happiness. And so the swastika is a symbol of happiness and joy, so tragic that this very holy symbol for the Hindus and the Buddhists and the Jains, all three religions consider it to be extremely holy, has become such a symbol of genocide and of one of the most awful things human beings could ever wreak on earth. And so symbols of the swastika, the word swastika appears in very early literature, in the Ramayana and so on. And they're shown in temple architecture. If you go to Singapore and other places, Buddhist temples have swastikas carved all over them. I'm going to point out to one temple in the 8th century here, which is 3 floors and west facing. And the reason I chose this temple out of thousands of temples in India is because this temple has 3 floors and is west facing, and there's only one other temple in the world which was built that way later on, except that temple was like this in a much bigger way. And that temple is Angkor Wat in Cambodia. And that is like this temple, except it's on steroids. So the Vaikuntha Perumal temple, Vaikuntha means heaven. And so it means the temple of the Lord on earth, intricately carved. And the beauty of these temples is, on one side, you see the carvings of, which if you see it in one way, would be the life history of the king. If you read it another way, it's stories of the deity in one of his avatars. So these are the many floored temples. I showed you temples going up into the sky, the towers, right? The towers reach up. But there are other forms of architecture in India, notably in 2 states called Rajasthan and Gujarat, where the temples go into the ground. Way down, these are called stepwells. And they were really built between the 8th, 13th centuries. And they're so beautiful that I wanted to share them with you. And it's like I'll talk about that in a minute. The spire, the tower, shows you aspirations going way up into heaven, reaching for higher things. And the stepwells talk about you going deeper and deeper inside yourself to understand who you are, what your soul is, to plumb the depths of your own soul. So the architecture allegorically shows the different aspirations you can have. It's not that one is good or one is bad and one is better than the other. Follow the path that's best for you, most suitable for you. And so this stepwell, Rani Ki Vav, is now in one of the, I think it's 100 or 1,000 rupee note in India, actually, a few years back. Goes all the way down, 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 down. And between these places, Rajasthan and the green state right under it, Gujarat, we find these stepwells. The one that I'm going to show you is called Chand Bauri. And it was built in 800. And this is what it looks like. It goes down, down, down. Oh, yeah, it's, by the way, Hollywood loves this place. There are lots of movies which took place there. Maybe even a James Bond, I don't recall. People, you can imagine them running down these stairs, right? So it's beautifully carved, and inside you have pavilions, way down, like 5 or 6 feet down, and inside them you have the deities installed. And you can see the water way down. And as you go down, it's about 5 or 6 degrees cooler, and people sit there like they sit on used to. It's now barricaded because people try to jump off. So this is Chandbauri, 800 CE, the Hindu god Ganesha inside. The sun temple in Modera has a smaller, it's one of the many sun temples built to the sun. It's a much smaller stepwell, but you get an idea with very intricate architecture there also. This is the stepwell in Modera. And it's not too bad. I mean, thinking that you can't press a delete button when you make a mistake here. You carve it. The ceiling and the different deities. There are earlier temples too with this kind of architecture. And the largest one is Rani Ki Vav in Patan in Gujarat, added to the UNESCO World Heritage Sites only recently. And it's 27 meters, that's about 90 feet deep. Sorry about rushing through all of them. Every one of them you can spend a lot of time, but I have 2 more continents to cover. So this is the goddess destroying the demon of evil. So you don't mess around with goddesses. She is good. She is goodness personified. She is grace personified. But when an evil guy comes near her, lusts after her, this is what she does. She kills him, like the buffalo. And that's all these carvings are on the side of Rani Ki Vav. And as I said, as you keep going down and down, you're plumbing into your own soul, your own stillness of your own being. And the sides are carved with different geometrical designs. And as usual, here too, the swastika makes an appearance, as in other forms, the lotus flower also. In the Ahmedabad area, we have a particular Muslim king built it for the queen Rani Rupba. And here, notice that these designs do not have gods or goddesses, human beings, because it was built by a Muslim for a Hindu queen. And going on through this particular one, we'll close off with India with just a couple of brief visuals. Khajuraho, I felt I had to show a little bit of that because, and the Sun Temple, because they're very renowned for their erotic sculpture. So they look, I thought it was safer to show them from zooming out than the zooming in of the erotic sculpture. So you have, on the one hand, the ascetic ideal, which is highlighted, and on the other side, the sensuous. So you find the sacred in the ascetic as well as in the sensuous out here. And you can see every detail of this woman looking into her mirror or into the deities who show their love for each other. And the great temples of the Chola dynasty in the 10th, 11th centuries built large spires, just as in Gujarat, you had them going down. In South India, you have the towers going up. And the Konarak Sun Temple, like Angkor Wat later on, a few years earlier, was built in accordance, in alignment with the movement of the sun. And on spring equinox, spring equinox, autumn equinox, and the solstices, the sun shines on particular parts of the temple. This is the wheel of time. As you can see, the details inside are all erotic sculptures also, and we can talk about the meanings much later if you'd like. The sun god. Notice on the left that he seems to be wearing boots. Why? The people who carved them were Muslims from Iran, the Persian Empire. And they built the sun god with with leather boots on. But the intricacies of the jewelry are particularly well known. And as you can see from here, the erotic sculptures were also popular. They continue to be built all over the world. The architecture adapts to local culture, and the temples connect the sacred and the secular, the expressions of local patronage, and include cosmological ideas. And the intricacies of art and aesthetic dimension are central. So we'll come to this. As I promised, about 3 minutes in Cambodia as an example of thousands of temples that was built in Southeast Asia. If you look at the left picture, it shows you the modern political map. Thailand is big. Just before under Thailand is Cambodia, a tiny peach-colored central part. But Cambodia, in the 12th century, look to the right, that's the pink empire. It is huge. It covers parts of Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, and so on. So it is an enormous Khmer empire. Most of my research in the last 22 years has been in this area, in Cambodia. And this is Angkor Wat. This is the temple which is like the early one I showed you, 3 floors, west facing, dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. And this is another form of Vishnu, right here. And on him, the river flows, the local river called Siem Reap, which people in Cambodia thought was like the Ganges River, Ganga, the holy river. So the geography was adapted to the local place. This is one side, they're taken during a December. This was taken during May, before the monsoon, so it's dry. Please look at this picture. Remember this picture. I'll come back to it. It shows a reclining Vishnu. And at his feet, you can see a little shape, which is really his wife, Lakshmi. And I'll come back to this picture. Angkor Wat was built in the 12th century, 1135. And the word Angkor simply means city. And it was dedicated to Vishnu, who is considered to be a solar deity. And today, it's a Buddhist temple. But when it was built, it was a Hindu temple. And today, nearby in Kabul, Spain, you can see what has happened to Vishnu. Remember what I showed you earlier? And that is a sad part. Angkor Wat faces west. It was considered to be a funerary monument. And my research, I show it's not, because many Hindu temples in India face west. And in the 13th century, 14th century, a Chinese diplomat speaks about the towers of Angkor Wat being gilded in gold. And he's just like, oh my God, people here are so rich. And even the temples are gilded with gold. Well, that gold's long gone. But during the sunset, it still looks pretty gold to me. And it was built in alignment, like I said, to the sun. And every day during a sabbatical in 2005, spring, I'd go there at sunrise. And every day the sun would come closer and closer. And on spring equinox, the sun rises exactly at the back, right behind. No one was there in those days, but now it's really crowded. The measurements of the causeways and the moats were calculated by 3 graduate students at the University of Michigan. And when they took the common denominators to see what would have been the unit of measurement in building Angkor Wat, they came up with numbers which were curiously like, and if you can't read it, don't worry, I'm just going to make the point, that the measurements of Angkor Wat correspond to the number of years in the cycles of time in Hindu cosmology. These three students, Robert Stencil, Fred Gifford, Eleanor Moron, didn't know when they were doing the research, they didn't know the meaning of these numbers until someone else pointed it all out to them and they were able to figure it out. So the whole temple was built like a calendar, measuring years and years of time, cosmic time. Oh my God, this got turned around. But you recognize her? I don't know how this got turned around, and I apologize. The Statue of Liberty, marking the transition from Southeast Asia, which I apologize, I spent only 5 minutes, my favorite place. But moving on to Cambodia and spending the last 5 minutes, moving on to United States and spending the last 5 minutes here into this land of liberty. The Vedanta temple was built under the instructions of a preacher called Vivekananda. And this was built in 1905. It's in San Francisco. And there were 5 towers that the local teacher, the guru, designed, and it was syncretic. At the back is like a tower, like a medieval castle from Europe, like a chessman set. And the others, and there's one on the right, way behind, which looks like a minaret from a mosque. And the other 3, including the onion-shaped one, like, kind of like the Russian-shaped one, are actually temple towers from different parts of India. So it was a syncretic temple. And when he built it, it was symbolic of a yogic anatomy. The canopy represented the head, the top of the head, which in Hindu cosmology, the top of your head had 1,000-petal lotus. And the eagle on top of that was the American eagle. But in Hindu mythology and narratives, Garuda, or the eagle, is the sacred mount of Vishnu. And when this was built, this doorway was tastefully painted red, white, and blue. Yes, they were American colors, but red, white, and blue were also the colors of the 3 gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. So this kind of came together. He thought it was symbolic. This was the first Hindu temple in this country. It had to be built with, sensitivity to both cultures and so on. But it's in post-1965, and why do I say 1965? 1965 saw the passage of a major immigration bill, which did away with what we call the quota system. And the quota system had allowed 100 people to immigrate from India every year. But in 1965, to keep up with the Russians, we needed more professionals in this country. So people with advanced degrees in engineering, the sciences, and medicine were given preference. And they were called visa preferences to migrate to this country. And so in the post-1965 wave of immigration, the first immigrants came to the United States. Many of them came thinking they'd go back, and they stayed. The children stayed here. Pushpa, were you part of the post-1968? Right, exactly. That's the first major wave. And they built the first Hindu temples. The temple culture here has continuities with India and Southeast Asia, with modifications. The architecture is supposed to evoke nostalgia of the home country. This performing arts introduced into the temples, and yet this responds to the local culture. The temple becomes a center for volunteer work, gender roles are changed, women have far more participation, and this architectural accommodation. which I won't get into. One example, you need handicap railings, you need a bathroom here in temples. In India, you wouldn't find a bathroom in a temple because it's considered to be a polluting place. So those are the kinds of accommodation. You have to build a temple according to local code, the county codes. So the earliest temples, and this is actually a fight between New York and the other one is in Pittsburgh. They were both built at the same time. So which one is first? There's no, they're duking it out here. And they were built in honor of the Hindu god Vishnu. And I just stuck to one god here for the talk so as not to be too confusing. And this temple was modeled after this one in India, which is considered to be the second richest religious institution, not Hindu, religious institution in the world, second to the Vatican. So the government of India, the currency in India is backed up with the gold in this temple. So the temples in this country are non-sectarian. That is, they're not devoted to any one god, but you find an array of gods. They include multiple deities. They have both North and South Indians because you need money. You need the people. And they include holy people, teachers from another religion called Jainism. Jainism technically is a different religion. It's like saying Judaism and Christianity, but we have them. So you have multiple deities, like in Knoxville here. And when they built the temple in Kalamazoo, Michigan, they sent out a questionnaire. And the first one asked, would you like to have deities in the temple? It's only in Hinduism that you'd have that question. What do you mean by that? Because you can have an empty temple. Some Hindus worship God with a form and some without. So they asked, yes or no? And we had equal number. If yes, how many deities would you like to have? And most of them said, no opinion. And then, if you want to have deities in the temple, which god do you want? And you had to vote for a god. So Ganesha, the tallest bar in the last diagram there, Ganesha, the elephant-headed god, won the popular vote. But someone said there was voter fraud. It wasn't even Florida. And so finally, they ended up having all gods out there. As I said, no Hindu temple is ever complete. I followed the Hindu temple of Atlanta, and this is what it looked like in 1992, kind of like a Babylonian fortress, you know? By 1996, it had been transformed. The outer part is built by American construction workers, and then the Indianization takes place. And this is what I call the palimpsest. The land that was held sacred by Native Americans is now reconsecrated. It's now made holy again with booster shots, if you will, by the Hindus who settle in the same country, the same land. So this is the palimpsest. You don't wipe out the early ones. You acknowledge them and you move and you build on their land, so to speak. This was the blueprint in 1992. To get here, it was 2022. So the temple is constantly evolving. And that's the point I'm making in the next few slides. Look at the Ganesha temple in Salt Lake City on the left, and on the right, 2018. Now, who contributes to these temples? Local population, and in this case, the Church of the Latter-day Saints. They've contributed to the building of this temple. And it is called the Hindu Temple Lane. Notice the Rocky Mountains in the back. Chicago, 1997, 2013. Orlando. Oh, this is what I meant by South Indian architecture, straight lines, not the curved lines. Tampa. And they're building it slowly. And this is a South Indian tower, which claims to be the tallest tower in this continent. Car Puja. What do I mean by car puja? You don't worship a god. But when you buy a new car or even a used car, but it's new for you. You take it there for dedication, and the priest comes out and does a little worship ceremony to be sure you didn't get a lemon, literally. And how do they do it? They put 4 lemons under the tires and the car goes over it. Yeah, really, really, really. But it's not for the same, not because for the phrase, don't get a lemon. It's too unrelated, but that's how we actually bless the car. Really. There is a certain similarity in the vocabulary of the architecture. On the left, you see a temple mountain. On the right, the Hindu temple in Atlanta. Sometimes you don't have the money to build a temple like this, a prestige temple. So what do? You buy a church. The price is right. And you make it, if it looks like a church, so be it. You make it into a temple. So the differences between the Indian and American temples, there are some goddesses who have a very angry demeanor, who are not depicted. Erotic sculpture is not found in American temples. Oh my God, can you imagine? It would be the favorite site for high school students. Folk traditions like walking on fire, the very fuzzy boundaries between Islam and Hindu traditions. And my colleague, Dr. Mian, spoke about this briefly the other day. They're not present here. So some gods and goddesses don't get a visa to come to this country. It's only the all-American gods like Vishnu who make it here. Kali, like this one, is ferocious, and she doesn't come. She doesn't come. Folk customs like walking on fire. Hey guys, the path is like twice the length of this room. And it's smoking. And the women who are in a trance and been fasting all day, they run across it. I've seen them do it. Erotic sculpture, that's not here in Hindu temples. And in some places in India, there are fuzzy boundaries between Hindus and Muslims. And Dr. Mian spoke about this 2 weeks ago, a place called the Dargah, where holy Muslim males and some females are enshrined. There's no such place. This is a Dargah where a Muslim saint is entombed in India. Most of the people who come there, the land for this place was given by Hindus. And many of the it's about 50-50 by way of Muslims and Hindus who come here. But here, religions because we need identity. You need to identify yourself. You're Hindu, you're not Muslim. You're Hindu, you're not Christian. It's not. Whereas in India, in some parts, there's fuzzy boundaries, not all. And that's changed rapidly in the last 20 years. The Dargah elephant was called Fatima. The closest I've seen is in California, where the foundation stone was laid by Pandit Ravi Shankar for the temple, the community hall, And the groundbreaking had been done by Ustad Ali Akbar Khan, but that's a rare kind of thing. There's changing gender roles. Women have more participation in this country, in the rituals, and this is in Inverness, Florida. And a final question, I'm going to wrap it up. I kind of took you through a whirlwind journey to show you what spaces look like, the worship spaces. But I'll leave you with a question. And I don't give an answer to it to my students, but I just leave it open-ended. This is a beautiful lintel which shows the bird Garuda, an eagle Garuda, with Vishnu on top. It's originally from Cambodia, a place called Prasad Kokpo, but it's in a museum in Paris. And I love this lintel. When I saw it in 2002, I kept going back to it. I was drawn, and I wanted to see this temple. I read and studied the inscriptions going back to the 8th and 9th century, and I couldn't wait to go back. And in 2002, I saw this in 2000. And in 2002, when finally the mines were removed, this is the bird below with Vishnu on top. when I went to Cambodia in 2002, April, we covered this artificial lake, but the temple was in ruins. All the sculpture had been taken out, sold in the black market, or been taken away by museums. So if the French had not taken it, I would not have seen it. And you saw the Cabal Spain architecture, exquisite ones, 2002 and 2003. But does the monument, if it's in a museum, an artifact, should it be returned? This is a god who's a hybrid god between Shiva and Vishnu. On the wall at the back is a picture, just an ordinary Xerox picture. I took this picture in 2005 in Cambodia. And this picture tells you where you can find the head. And the head is in Paris. And there's no sign nearby which says where the body is, where the body is in. But this story has a happy ending. In 2016, the head was returned and the god was reunited with his head. You can scarcely open up the New York Times today without seeing an article on the repatriation of different artifacts from Australia, from this country, to India, or to Cambodia. Britain has not done too much of that, and most of India's stuff is there. So I leave you with an image. As I was coming down Cabal, Spain, I saw a dead tree struck by a lightning, beautiful, but not alive. And right next to it was this very lush banana tree filled with fruit. And it kind of almost metaphorically made me think about Hinduism. It's dead in Cambodia. It's not a live religion. Cambodia is a Buddhist country. But in California, in Arizona, in Florida, it's alive and flourishing. Thank you. Okay, questions?
Okay, any questions here in our Oak Room? I have a question here.
Beverly?
On the temples like Angkor Wat, where they have the kind of cone shape, tall parts, does light come through there, or is it?
You
I
mean,
can
are they
see-
like skylights? Some of them do, some of them don't. Angkor Wat doesn't have them, but since it's in 3 floors, there are many doors, and the sun comes in through the doorways. A little bit like some of the cathedrals in Europe, medieval Europe, where they were built such that the doors faced and were aligned in a way. In many European cathedrals, the doors are structured in such a way that the rising sun will come and fall on a nave on the feast day of the saint of that cathedral. And you find this in many places in Europe, including Durham and so on. So archaeoastronomy is not unique to India or Southeast Asia. The earliest examples you may find may have been Egypt and also Central America, where many of the temples in Mesoamerica have been built with what the whole field called archaeoastronomy. Yeah.
Okay, Richard Petway, go ahead.
Oh, Anne-Marie Rizzo had had a hand up.
All
Sorry.
right.
Yes, I'm so glad that you mentioned the repatriation of some statues and memorabilia to their original cultures, because I think we hear so much about the Elgin marbles in Britain and how they're never going to go back to Greece.
Permanent loan.
Yeah.
And the British Museum even argued that they have more people will see it out there than ever in Greece. So it has a better home in Britain.
Right.
I love that.
We can
That's why we let them
rationalize.
rule us for 300 years.
Right, right. We can rationalize anything. And I've been to the Musée Guimet, and there's very little description on those exact items that you're talking about. So you really don't understand the value. But if they were in their native lands, somehow, I think it would be better. But that's not my question. I wonder if you have, first of all, an idea about following this up with a sequel, because this was such a rich class that I'm just amazed at how I can follow up on this. So I'm wondering about that and whether or not you have a book or two to share.
I'm actually on sabbatical next year to write 2 books, one on Hindu temples in Cambodia and one on America. I actually started to write my book on Hindu temples in America 20 years ago. And forgive me for this memory, 22 years ago. And I was going to do one chapter on early temples in other parts of the world. And I thought I'd have 2 paragraphs on Cambodia and picked up a few books from Library West and the Art Library, thinking, oh, I'll summarize all that in 2 paragraphs. 22 years later, I still haven't done that book because I fell into that architecture in Cambodia. I was intellectually appalled with myself for having taught Hinduism for 25, 30 years without ever taking Southeast Asia into account. And so I felt I had to teach myself, learn. So I had to change fields, change disciplines, move from being a textualist to being an art historian. So I'm writing, but there are other great books. There are wonderful books I'd be very happy to recommend. One by Thierry Zephyr from the Musée Guimet, Thierry Zephyr. And he wrote a great book on Cambodia and many others. So I'd be happy to follow it up with articles, encyclopedia articles, and share those articles with you online. If I can send them to Julie, she can send them to you. Anyone who's interested, ask Julie, because we don't want to clog up mailboxes with attachments.
That's great.
Yeah, sure.
I have a question.
Hi, Richard.
Hi. Um, so I have an issue or concern about alignments. So Angkor Wat follows a lot of temples around the world, all the way from the Maya culture here in Mexico, with different forms of alignments that are pretty critical to the orientation of these monuments. And I have a technical question about at points of time when you can see the North Star, the alignment it sometimes is a little bit more precise than just a general north kind of area. And I'm kind of wondering about, can you see the North Star from Angkor Wat or not?
I'm afraid I don't have an answer to yours. I've never tried to look at the North Star. Angkor Park is closed after sunset. So one has to return to the city, which now is like a neon town because of the tourists. And even if I wanted to, I don't think I could see the North Star now. I should have tried 22 years back when I was there, when things were pretty low key and there were like 4 or 5 hotels. And, I had Angkor Wat pretty much to myself in those days. And so I don't know the question, but theoretically, technically, I'm sure people will know the answer to it, and I'll try to find out.
Okay, and let me have a follow-up, please. For example, in the Maya culture, there is a strong alignment with the North, but it seems to have been that sometimes they will follow the precedent by previous temples built, which are slightly out of alignment. Most of the Maya cultures are a little bit off of north-south orientation by a fixed amount, something like 7 degrees to the left. of where they should be in a perfect alignment. And so there is this argument about whether the following precedents of other monuments that miss the alignment, is that something important to follow the precedent, or do each temple go to a perfect alignment, or their assumption of a perfect alignment?
Oh,
Or
that's
do they
a
follow
question for
precedent?
astronomy, which I don't know. I suspect they were fairly close, but I don't know if this is one of the cases where over time things move slightly. I've had these things being explained to me several times. Sorry, I have a pea brain and it just goes in and out. So I apologize. I don't know the answer to your question.
Thank you very
Julie?
much.
Yes, go
Julie?
ahead, Paul. I saw that you had unmuted. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I can't get my hand to raise on the
Okay, go ahead. We got you.
section. Thank you so much. That was fascinating, and I loved seeing the Hindu temples in situ in Cambodia and in India. I mentioned in an earlier session that I spent many years living in Indonesia, and I probably know enough to be dangerous about Hinduism in India and in Indonesia, but you can't miss it because it's found in the architecture of many buildings, and it is in East Java. There is in Central Java actually is Prambanan and Borobudur, Borobudur is the great temple to Buddhist temple.
Yeah,
Prambanan is the great
Hindu
Hindu
temple.
which in size, I guess, in dimensions of the land, is as big as Angkor Wat.
Yeah.
It is a huge complex that still has not been fully uncovered. And Borobudur is a World Heritage Site as well, with a pyramid that has as a bas relief the life of Buddha, and it is just slightly smaller than the pyramid in Giza. It's an extraordinary place if you have seen it. And Bali, the famous resort, is Hindu and is loaded with temples, as is Lombok, which is next door. Bali is perhaps not the same variety of Hinduism you find in India, but it is a wonderful place to see how Hinduism has modernized in a resort culture, I suppose. But it is still an exotic place in many places. If you get outside the resort areas,
Absolutely.
they are practicing Hinduism. And East Java is Abangan, which is a mix of Hinduism and Muslim. And it is a very mystical combination of the two religions, and is probably the dominant, though they say they're Muslim, but it is dominantly Abangan, which is the combination. Hinduism, the two great temples were built in the 10th and 9th centuries, so it goes way back before Cambodia, actually. And it is interesting to be in Yogyakarta, where they're located, and they still use Sanskrit in their writings.
Yeah.
For signs on the stores and so
That's
forth.
quite true.
Know that. But it is a marvelous place if you want to see how syncretic religions emerge, because you even find among Abangan a mixes of Christianity. So it's quite a complex country in many respects, but certainly religiously, it is just a smorgasbord.
Yeah, there's a lot of Sanskrit out there. Thank you for that. There's a lot of Sanskrit. Even a person like political names like something Sukarno Putri is
Yes.
like daughter of Sukarno. It's a Sanskrit term. So the names are all very Sanskritized, even if they're Muslims. And the Borobudur, the vocabulary of that architecture actually seems more like Central America
Yes,
or Egypt than India. But there's a shared Southeast Asian vocabulary there in the architecture. And I didn't show you those temples today from Cambodia. They're like pyramid mountains. And the
Yes.
pyramid mountains were for largely for the Hindu god Shiva, because he lives on top of a mountain. So Borobudur and many others are artificial temple mountains. Thank you.
I know we've
Yep.
gone over our time, but Phyllis Saranen, go ahead.
Yeah, the last question. Thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Vasu, for a fascinating lecture. Wonderful, wonderful images, and your caffeine deficit was not apparent. Perhaps you remember Suresh Suthuraman, who was brought down to Gainesville by the Archaeological Institute of America.
Yes, I do. Yes.
Yes, and he talked about the Hindu influence in Angkor Wat. He didn't mention Indonesia, but of course, we've all seen, or I don't know if we've all seen, but many of us have seen images that Paul was talking about Indonesia, Bali, Java, so forth. And the fuzziness that you mentioned between Islam and Hinduism in India, nevertheless, there's conflict.
Quite a bit, especially recently. Absolutely.
And there, of course, Indonesia is also now predominantly Muslim, or at least that's my impression. So does this fuzziness exist there as well?
There was, but there are 2 points I want to make in that. The fuzziness, thank you, that's a very complex question. At any given time, there was fuzziness, lines drawn in water, as well as very sharp, not just lines, but strong walls between the traditions. So at the same time, you would have the dargahs and the ease of the amiable relations between the Hindus, between Hindus and Muslims. At the same time, you had the acrimonious. Since the acrimonious part of it has been highlighted in recent decades, part of my scholarship has been shown the very strong fuzzy boundaries as well of the peace that has existed, the syncretism in music and in architecture over hundreds of years, along with the anger, the warfare, the bloodshed. Both are real and both have to be counted. It's been particularly so in the last 25, 30 years, where there has been, in the quote unquote identity making stage, looking to certain forms of Islam from Arabia rather than the Persian varieties in India. In India, they drew Islam from both the Persian kind of thinking as well as from Saudi Arabia, but recently it's been, even the words, the vocabulary has changed. And now it's become more of one strain from Saudi Arabia, which is more strict, more, so in that sense, it leaves out the other, as Hindu nationalism has also mounted. So people have been, moving in different directions. And you're right to point out that. Nevertheless, the dargah still continues. And those forms, the spaces where music, rituals, literature, arts, where there's so much of coming together, they are having the boundaries being drawn now. And that's to our loss and the tragedy.
Islam came to Indonesia by way of China.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we
Thank
are.
you so much.
Very strange.
Thank you all for being here today. Appreciate it. One more talk next week with performing arts. Thank
Yes,
you.
and I just want to thank Vasu. I think everyone shares my view that this was really an incredible lecture and gave us lots of things to think about, particularly for me in particular. It was noting how temples and so forth have changed with people immigrating to the United States, how that might be different. So, but I just want also to remind you that next week, the focus is on Indian dancing. And so you need to come to the Oak Room. There will be no Zoom for this. So please come, and come early if you're coming from outside Oak-Hammock. Thanks.
Thank you.